Hi everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of videos I put together for you for class on April 28th of 2020. This week what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a way in which we can evaluate whether a policing intervention is effective in preventing or reducing crime. And so this week we'll tackle this subject in three parts. The first part of these lectures I'm going to be discussing research methods and evidence-based policing, and I'll go over some research designs that are capable of discerning whether an intervention that's put in place in policing is effective in preventing crime. In the second part, I'm going to cover an actual intervention with you. So I'm going to go over the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment, which was a intervention that was put in place in Philadelphia in the summer of 2009 to test whether foot patrols, when conducted at violent crime hotspots, can successfully reduce crime. And then after I cover that intervention with you, we will apply similar methods to test whether a hypothetical intervention was effective in preventing crime. So I've provided you with data that relates to this intervention in a spreadsheet on Blackboard, and I'll walk you through how you can organize this data so that you can input it into a weighted displacement quotient calculator and ultimately discern whether the intervention was effective in reducing crime or not, and whether crime was displaced to other locations. And I'll talk a little bit more about displacement as this lecture moves forward. But before we do, I just want to discuss evidence-based policing before we get into these research methods. If you've taken my critical issues class, you've hopefully heard of evidence-based policing before. And just very briefly, evidence-based policing is a law enforcement perspective or philosophy that implicates the use of research, evaluation, analysis, and the scientific processes in law enforcement decision-making. And the part that I really want to highlight here is this part here, evaluation. And now if you think back to last week when we were going over problem-oriented policing and the SARA model of problem-oriented policing, hopefully you remember that the A, that last A in the SARA model, corresponded to assessment, or in other words, testing whether what we've done during a problem-oriented policing intervention was effective. And so evaluation and assessment, we can use these terms interchangeably. And so we're going to focus on the evaluation aspect of evidence-based policing this week, or in other words, how we can actually discern whether an intervention was effective. And so you might be thinking to yourself, well, where does this evidence come from? Where does this evaluation evidence and research come from? Right? Who studies this stuff? And very often it's university professors. Like, so some of the professors that you've had here at Rowan have been involved in evaluation research with police agencies. Right, so if and when you take my critical issues class, you'll read a lot of research from Cynthia Lum, who's a prominent policing scholar, David Weisberg, another prominent policing scholar, and Lawrence Sherman. And so these just three examples I pulled from the top of my head of university professors who are engaged in research to help police understand whether what they're doing is effective. And this could relate to preventing crime or a number of other goals. And now the great thing about reading research from university professors is that you know that it's going to be conducted in a high quality way. So typically before before research is disseminated, the research is written up in the form of a journal article, and then it becomes submitted to a journal, and we have reviewers who are experts in the field that look over the research and point out any potential concerns that they have with the research design or the conclusions itself, and eventually this research becomes published. And so in critical issues and also this semester, we've read some peer-reviewed research. And this is really what we want to rely on in deciding what sorts of tactics we're going to implement. So if you think back to 3 weeks ago, we looked at the 3I model of intelligence-led policing. And in that last step of the 3I model, we have decision makers who are hopefully implementing evidence-based policing policies in the field so that they can have an impact on the criminal environment. And so here we're going to talk a little bit about how this evidence comes about, right? So how do we learn whether policing tactics are effective or not? right? Because we've got to remember that unfortunately policing is rather political. And so there are a number of people who have a vested interest in saying that what they're doing works. And so I've got two examples up here on the screen. And if you don't recognize these faces, on the left we have Raymond Kelly, who was the previous NYPD police commissioner. When I was a police officer in New York, he was my boss. He led the NYPD. And on the right we have Mayor Michael Bloomberg, or former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, I should say, who was head of New York City during my time as a police officer as well. So of course, because policing is political, we have commissioners and mayors and other politicians who want to say that they're having an impact on crime and what they're doing is working. But we should always be a little bit skeptical about claims that are made about policing strategies that don't have any research evidence. So what do I mean here? Well, a couple of years ago, this article came out, and you could read the headline of the article. It says, former NYPD commissioner, here we're talking about Ray Kelly, says that Mayor Bill de Blasio is endangering the lives in New York City by abandoning stop and frisk policy. So those of you who haven't followed stop and frisk in New York City, beginning in the early 2000s, I should say the late 90s and into the early 2000s, there was an emphasis in New York on performing stop and frisks. And as stop and frisks increased, crime in New York City declined. And so there were some who made a connection between stop and frisk and crime reductions. So for example, Ray Kelly and Michael Bloomberg held for many years that the reductions in crime in New York City could directly be attributed to the NYPD's policy. And so when this article came out, this was in 2016, we had a new mayor come and take over New York City, and that's the current mayor, Bill de Blasio. And because of concerns that were raised by the community that related to stop and frisk and its overuse, Mayor Bill de Blasio actually abandoned the NYPD stop and frisk policy. And so this article discusses that the former commissioner, Ray Kelly, was critical of Mayor de Blasio, and he said that in getting rid of this stop and frisk policy, what he was doing was putting New Yorkers at risk, because he's claiming that stop and frisk in New York City is directly related to the crime reductions that were realized. However, it's really difficult, if not impossible, for Commissioner Kelly to claim that his tactics and strategies like stop and frisk were effective. And we could just look at a peer-reviewed article by one of the professors that I discussed, David Weisbord and his colleagues. Right, one of the first things they say in a paper that they published that looked at the crime reduction benefits of stop, question, and frisk in New York City, they say that available data make it impossible to reach strong conclusions about the role of policing in New York crime decline. Right, so despite claims by politicians and by the commissioner that the NYPD's policies were the catalyst for crime reductions in New York City, the truth is it's really difficult to make that connection. And that's because so much was going on in New York City during the 1990s and 2000s. So economics were changing, the city was becoming much more wealthy, we had lots of people moving out of the city because it became too expensive. Right? There's just so much going on that it makes it so hard to say definitively that the NYPD's tactics were responsible for crime reductions. And so you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, if we can't trust politicians or even a police commissioner, well, how do we know whether what the police is doing is effective or not? And one way to think about this is by thinking about how medical treatments come onto the market. Right? So how do medical researchers know what works? Typically what they do is they conduct clinical trials and experimental medical treatment evaluations. Right? So during medical interventions where we're testing some new treatment, if we break it down to the most basic level, how this is done is we take a group of patients who are suffering some underlying illness, and we randomly put them into a treatment group or a control group. We administer the new drug to the treatment group, and we give a placebo or a sugar pill to the control group, and then at the end of that intervention we can say, or we can see whether the treatment group performed better in terms of health outcomes than the control group. So we could apply this to policing as well. So I've got a graphic here that I think hopefully clears this up in terms of how this works. Right, so let's say, just like in the example I just gave you, we've got a group of patients who are suffering some illness, and what we're going to do first to test this new drug that we want to put on the market is we're going to break them into two groups, right? That treatment group that I mentioned and that control group. So what we would do is we would just randomly place people into these two groups. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but this randomization, right, just randomly putting these people so that there's no more of a likelihood that they're in a treatment group compared to the control group, becomes important because this gets rid of any potential bias in our study. And that's really all I'll say about that. There's a whole lot more that can be said, and hopefully you've taken a research methods class where you learned about randomized controlled trials. Right, but after these two groups are decided upon, and we've got our patients in our treatment group and we've got our patients in our control group, like I said, we will give each of these groups a medication. However, the treatment group is only going to get the real medication. The control group is just going to get a fake treatment, like a sugar pill. In the strongest of studies, even the researchers don't know which group is the treatment group or the control group. And again, the goal here is to look at the end of this trial to see, do we see better outcomes in terms of reductions of illness in this treatment group relative to the control group. Right, so this is considered the strongest research design. It's considered the gold standard in research, not just medical research, but also in policing research. Right, so we use this same model to evaluate policing tactics as well. And I'm going to talk much more about this in coming videos for this week. But for example, the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment that I mentioned, this was an experimental evaluation. It didn't involve people, rather it involved places. And so what we're looking at here is a map that's depicting the treatment beats or the control beats, and the control beats. So treatment beats are in red, control beats are in white. And I'll discuss the design a little bit more, but how this worked was there were 120 high crime hotspots that were identified, and they were just randomly put into those treatment groups or control groups in a similar way that I demonstrated with the previous slide. And then what happened was, in the treatment beats, we had an increased police presence using foot patrols. And the control beats just got standard policing. And at the end of this intervention, we can then test whether the places that got increased foot patrols, right, these red beats, had lower levels of crime relative to these control beats in white. Right, so this same model that's used in medicine, it has been applied to policing before. And this really is the strongest research design that we can develop to test policing interventions. So I'm just about at my 15-minute video limit. So what I'm going to do before I get into quasi-experiments, I'm going to end here, and we'll pick up in the second video by going over just two more research designs. Before I end, I'll pose the first quiz question to you, and that is, what is considered the gold standard in evaluation research? And to give you the answer, it is the randomized control trial. Right, that is considered the gold standard in evaluation research in policing as well as in other fields. All right, so we will end here. I will see you in video 2, where I'll pick up with going over quasi-experiments and then correlational research designs.